Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Laura Laurent, and on this week we delve into the complex intersection of social contract theory and classical natural law with our guest, Dr. Paul DeHart, who is the author of The Social Contract in the Ruins. In his provocative new work, Dr. DeHart challenges the widely held belief that social contract theory and classical natural law are incompatible. He argues that attempts to ground political authority and obligation solely in human agreement are inherently self-defeating. Instead, he's going to contend that moral authority must rest on an uncreated, objective good, one that goes beyond the scope of human or divine will. Without this, even the foundational principle of government by consent lacks coherence. Dr. DeHart brings years of experience to this conversation. He is a professor of political science at Texas State University and the author of Uncovering the Constitution's Moral Design, as well as the co-author of Reason, Revelation, and the Civic Order. With a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and a deep background in political philosophy, Dr. DeHart offers valuable insights into the foundations of political authority and the enduring relevance of classical natural law. So get ready for a rich discussion on the philosophical underpinnings of political legitimacy and the moral framework required for true government by consent. All right, Dr. DeHart, thank you so much for joining us today on Madison's Notes. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about your new book, The Social Contract in the Ruins. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it. I guess I should say long-time listener, first-time caller.
Well, we like to pull from our audience list, so we're happy that we could find you. So first off, with your book, can you give us just a brief overview of what you're presenting in this book and how you came to wanting to write such a prolific and well thought out piece about these subjects?
While I was wrapping up my dissertation, and which would become my first book, Jay Budziszewski handed me a paper by Nick Wolterstorff and a response by him from a conference they'd both been at. And part of Wolterstorff's argument involved going through some of the critique of social contract theory in terms of government by consent. And here I am working on the foundations of the Constitution, and I thought, well, there are some interesting problems or questions surrounding consent theory, which of course is a bedrock principle of the American political order. I think political theorists such as myself get into disputes about what the foundations are. I'm on the classical side of that. There are others who argue that it's founded in modern political thought and Thomas Hobbes. As I was working through that, I thought, well, it's one thing that's sort of, I think, undeniable is the extent to which government by consent is a major thread, and a kind of social contract theory moves through the American founding, sometimes tied back to Locke, but I think that's I think that's partly true, but it's also a little bit simplistic. It clearly ties to Sydney and covenantal traditions and is a richer foundation than just Locke. But this is the government by consent contractarianism is through our political tradition and at the foundations of it. And as I'm reading the Wolterstorff paper and thinking this through, think, well, a lot of legal theorists have some pretty good arguments about problems with actual consent and the paucity of actual consent and why tacit consent is a problem. So if you think if we say we need consent of the governed as a necessary condition of political authority and obligation for some to have authority over others and others to have obligation to obey them, for a regime to be legitimate. The Declaration of Independence, just political powers are derived from the consent of the governed. Well, it would seem then that we need real consent, actual consent. If we read Thomas Hobbes and some other theorists, it may be the case that they're okay with hypothetical consent. There's this old line, I think there's a version in Dworkin, but a line as adapted, usually attributed to Robert Nozick, that goes something like this: hypothetical contracts aren't worth the paper they're not written on. And I think that's something to that. So the fact that we need real consent, actual consent, and there seems to be a lack of express consent that people have given. Might lead one to say, well, if you need consent and you don't have actual consent, you don't have a valid political order. You don't have a legitimate political order. You've missed a necessary condition. You don't have political authority, political obligations, and so a lot of so that's why some people retreated to hypothetical consent. It was, well, we lack that, and others like Locke seem to retreat to tacit consent. Now, Locke knows or holds that you need explicit consent to be a full-blown citizen, to have the all the privileges and responsibilities of a citizen, to be a permanent member of the community. But he knows that there is a paucity, as A. John Simmons points out, a paucity of explicit consenters. So he retreats to tacit consent, implied consent. But then Simmons proceeds to lay out why none of the signs of tacit consent are signs of tacit consent or really work. For instance, residing in a place doesn't seem to be a conscious, voluntary act by most people. They just reside in a place, and enjoying the benefits of a place is not in itself consenting to something. It's enjoying benefits. It's a benefaction theory. It's a different theory than consent theory is, and so it seems that there's a lack of this thing that consent theorists claim that we need. Does anybody actually consent? And this struck me as what we might call the de facto problem of consent theory, the need for real consent, not just hypothetical consent. I don't have an obligation to keep promises I would have made, but did not actually make, right? So, I'm bound by the covenant of marriage with respect to my wife because I actually made promises explicitly there in front of people. But somebody can't come up to me and say, well, there's some scenario in which you would have married this other person. And so you, in fact, have obligations to say, well, no, I'm bound by the promises I did make, not ones I would have made. And how many people have then actually consented to the political order in which they find themselves? And the answer is very few. And this raises for me the de facto problem. And it's something perhaps that we can circle back to. So as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about the lack of consent, but also you say, well, why not just abandon consent theory at that point? Or why not look for something else? And I thought, well, there may be some problems in Locke or others. The idea that consent is necessary because human beings are equal, that relations of authority, that some people ruling others, is not given simply by nature. It may be natural to have political authority, but who rules whom? Or the authority of the regime isn't given by nature insofar as human beings are equal. And that's not just an idea in modern political contractarian thought. That's also a problem that Aristotle addresses. This is not given by nature. And so I thought, well, given human equality, we might want to still hold on to the idea of consent. We might really say we really do need it on the one hand, and yet we seem to have a paucity of it over here. And so that's one kind of problem. And that started as I'm wrapping up my dissertation. I'm working on my first book. I'm beginning to find myself in the grips of a distinct problem. And it seems like it's not unimportant, given that we live in a regime in which our founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence, for instance, like the Virginia Declaration of Rights, speak of the necessity of consent. Now, sometimes they speak of the necessity of corporate consent. Sometimes they seem to be talking about individual consent, but nevertheless, the necessity of the consent of the governed to political authority in order to have political obligations to obey it. And this is pervasive in our founding documents. And so it struck me as something that, given the kind of regime we have, given human equality, there are those who would just say so much the worse for it. I think of progressivism to a degree on the left. Think of Woodrow Wilson and political organicism. I actually think that theories about national democracy might be organicist ways of eluding the necessity of consent. But I also think of post-liberal theories on the right that sort of say, well, to hell with the American tradition. We think that it gives rise to too many problems. We think maybe that the necessity of consent, political contractarianism, is founded in some kind of moral contractarianism, right? And at that point, I begin to look at a de jure problem because moral contractarianism, which is we can come back to if you want. Moral contractarianism, the idea that morality is something made, and in particular, maybe something that we make, is ultimately an incoherent view. So that if political consent theory, consent for political authority and obligations, rests on a constructed morality, normative constructivism, sometimes they call it normative positivism or conventionalist accounts of justice, that we are the ones that make it, or that the good, the ought, just and unjust, these are somehow made. If those are really wed together, then there is a problem if moral contractarianism is incoherent and political contractarianism rests on it. But I don't think that it does. I don't think that these things are really connected. I think, for instance, for Richard Hooker at places in the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, or for James Wilson in his law lectures, there is both an insistence on consent for Hooker and the foundations of government, given human equality, and then of a people to their government. In Algernon Sidney, and in James Wilson, who is very much committed to an objective good, an objective right. But there are a lot of folks out there who think, oh no, moral contractarianism, we make it, goes with political contractarianism. And so these things begin to turn over in my mind, and I thought, well, we have a regime founded on consent. We, on the one hand, have practical problems, but on the other hand, it might be intellectually reckless, might be civically reckless to just say, well, so much the worse. There are these problems that present themselves to us. But there's some reason for holding on to the principle of consent.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, so something that was more unique about your book, what stood out to me is the argument that classical natural law is actually supportive of social contract theory, and that they're not as opposed as they often are put against one another. And for our listeners who maybe had some of this, social contract theory education back in their college days or in high school, but haven't necessarily revisited it in a while, can you give us a brief, up-to-date version of why those two things are often put at odds to one another?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. Nick Wolterstorff mentions that maybe these things have been juxtaposed. Classical natural law, by which I mean a view of right and wrong and principles of right and wrong that are grounded in a moral and metaphysical realism. There's a real good at which the moral order aims, if you will. And on the classical natural law view, human laws are only valid or binding insofar as they are in some way grounded in the natural law and not contrary to it. They're only valid laws. And the view that we find in Thomas Aquinas, but there are versions that we find in Richard Hooker and foundational tenets we find in Cicero and Aristotle and others. And it's often said that social contract theory is framed over and against classical Aristotelian or Thomistic political theory, or Richard Hooker as well, and was framed as an alternative to that way of thinking. Often, this is because social contract theory is said to have its headwaters in the thought of Thomas Hobbes, one of the architects of modern thought, modern political thought, and intellectually, at any rate, of the modern state. And Hobbes, who certainly is he wouldn't have called himself a social contract theorist, I don't think. He'd call himself a covenant theorist. He uses the word covenant instead, but he grounds his covenant, leaving a state of nature, and we'll come to that in a moment, in very modern philosophical views. So when we begin with Hobbes, Hobbes is a materialist. Everything that exists is matter in motion. I think nevertheless, I agree with Al Martinich that he's a kind of quixotic theist rather than an atheist. Pache Alexander Hamilton on that point. I like Hamilton, but I think he gets Hobbes wrong on that point. But he is a materialist. He's a determinist. His account of what we know is external matter in motion creates internal matter in motion, and we experience this internal matter in motion, these images, and he says, and we're moved through the world. We're either attracted or repelled by things, and to the extent that we're attracted to them, that's a good for us. And to the extent that we're repelled by things, some things escape our notice, but to the extent that we're repelled by things, that we're averse to it, that is an evil for us, there being nothing simply or absolutely good. But good and evil are relative to desire and aversion. And in the state of nature, desire and aversion of individuals are the only measure of good and evil, what he calls the natural condition. Imagine a condition in which there is no political society, civil society, no commonwealth, no sovereign, no law. He says, in that state of affairs, good and evil is relative to the desires and aversions of the individual. And in political society, it is simply relative to the law. His account of good and evil I take to be an application of his philosophical nominalism. That is, he denies that there are objective essences. There are only particular things. There's not, if you will, humanness or humanitas. There's John and Jane and this man and that woman. He would say there's not elephantness. There's this pachyderm and that pachyderm and what have you, right? And so one of the hinges in the move towards modernity, and you find it in the 17th century theorists, is this idea that there are no real universals, there are no universal essences, there are only particulars. And Hobbes then takes that and applies that to good and evil. These are by nature subjective. It also follows that just and unjust are not founded in nature, but are rather matters of agreement or covenant or omnipotent imposition, the legislation of irresistible power, just as such. That's the Hobbesian view of things. In fact, Hobbes at one point says the reason that ethics and politics are sciences is because they come from principles that we make, like geometry. I don't think most people who do geometry think we make the principles, but Hobbes thought, well, we make the principles in geometry, right? And he says, well, then that's what's a science. That's why it can be demonstrative and deductive and a priori. It comes from principles we make. And he says ethics and politics are like that. Well, he then proceeds to talk about the condition of mere nature as a condition without political order, in which good and evil are subjective. There is no right and wrong. He speaks of human beings as radically individual, not social by nature. He's deeply opposed to the Aristotelian idea that humans are political animals, that human beings are political and social by nature. Rather, our natural passions incline us to war and to conflict with each other. So by nature, we're not social. By nature, we're opposed. By nature, there is no good and evil. Apart from desire and aversion, in a condition of nature, there's no just and unjust, and this is an awful condition. What would life be like under conditions of anarchy? The war of all against all, in which life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. If you're a rational person, says Hobbes, you'd want to escape that condition if you could. If you found, not that you ever will find yourself in such a state, but if you did. Or to put what I think he's really getting at, you would not want to fall into such a state. So what would it take to get out of one if you were in it, or to avoid falling into one? And he says, well, what it takes is a covenant, an agreement of everyone with everyone to establish a commonwealth that authorizes an absolute, unlimited, indivisible sovereign power. But this sovereign power is established by the agreement of everyone with everyone, right? Now, Hobbes is deeply modern in his commitments. He's deeply anti-scholastic, anti-Aristotelian. You hear in Book 4 of Hobbes' Leviathan, when he talks about Aristotle, echoes of Martin Luther, right? The Protestant reformer and monk saying you can't become a theologian with Aristotle, but only against Aristotle, and Hobbes saying, there's nothing worse written in politics than what Aristotle has to say about it, or metaphysics, or so it's very modern. And then folks say, well, that's where Hobbes is a social contract theorist or a covenant theorist. Get out of it by agreement. The idea that we ground political order in an agreement, which for Hobbes seems to be a hypothetical agreement, not an actual agreement. You would consent to establish political authority if you could. Not that you'll ever find yourself in such a situation. But folks say, well, Hobbes is the headwaters of this. The philosophical foundations must be Hobbesian, and so it must be modern. And I have, I guess, two responses to that way of thinking.
Yeah, tell us what those are, because it's something that we often see Hobbes by himself or put against Locke, and that's not the full conversation. So what are those two?
Yeah. So I have a book on the shelf that I assign to senior seminar or capstone students sometimes. It's called The Social Contract Theorist. It's entirely an anthology of secondary source essays entirely on Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. As if this exhausts thinking about government by consent. And it's got some really good essays in it, but there's no pretending that there might be older or other roots here. And so part of the answer is historic, and some of the excavation and the really the groundwork, the important spade work has been done by Quentin Skinner and some in his school, which is to say, we have, for instance, followers of St. Thomas in the Counter-Reformation period and in the early modern period who speak about a state of nature, status naturale, who speak about leaving the state of nature by means of consent, who seem to have the basic elements of consent theory. And so you might call it social contract theory before Hobbes. You also have this in Richard Hooker. And it's in vogue, I think, with some political theorists to say, Locke was insincere, not genuine in his use of Richard Hooker. And I think they disagree in metaphysics. But if you actually read Richard Hooker, he doesn't use the phrase state of nature, so far as I can tell, but the concept is clearly there. The time before there was a public regiment, and it's this terrible time. People are living according to their own judgments about what they should do, and there's no possible redress or remedy for injuries. And because this situation is so bad, people consent to form political society in Richard Hooker. So I think that there is what we might call a legitimate, a real Hookerian political consent tradition. Now, it's not, I think, identical to Locke, but I think there's something that's really there. Also, Johannes Althusius was a kind of Aristotelian. He uses Aristotle's four causes when he talks about political order. Yeah, he speaks of, like Aristotle would, of the Constitution as the form of a regime. He speaks of the common good as the telos, or the end of political order. But then, perhaps in contrast to Aristotle, but in keeping with the basic framework, he says, but consent or agreement is the efficient cause of political order. So and it's interesting, right? You'll find theorists who know that Althusius anticipates many moves in Locke, who will speak of the influence from one to the other. I've never found a direct connection. There is an obscure reference somewhere in Rousseau to Althusius that I don't know that it comes to much. I doubt Rousseau ever read him, and their differences would have been substantial. But what I think is the late Brian Tierney once talked about American federalism and the degree to which it parallels federalism in Althusius. And he said, I don't imagine the American founders or framers read Althusius, and I can't say that they read somebody who read Althusius. He says, but I think that what they did was to arrive at the same set of insights from a similar way of thinking. And I think something's going on there too in terms of government by consent. So I think there is a consent tradition, both in counter-reformational thought, that it grounds itself in equality. I think we can see this in Francisco Suarez, for instance. Not only Suarez, but the Salamancan school more generally. And we find elements of it in Bellarmine, Filmer's great opponent. Filmer was deeply opposed to what he regarded as natural liberty and natural equality in Cardinal Bellarmine, right? And John Locke goes after Filmer exactly where Filmer goes after Bellarmine. Locke never says, well, therefore Bellarmine had it right or something like that. But it's interesting, right? He's attacking Filmer where Filmer's attacking Bellarmine. And we have Hooker, we have Althusius and other theorists. So I think there's another tradition, and that's on the history of thought side. So I think, listen, it's not just Hobbes. For that matter, there are important differences between Hobbes and Locke, although I think they both have similar metaphysical foundations. I think that the biographers of Locke are right to suggest that John Locke sounded more Hobbesian on the sovereignty front early in his life, but then shifted from that sort of authoritarian position to an anti-authoritarian position. So I think Locke's political theory is a state of nature, social contract theory, government by consent, that is different than Hobbes' political theory, even though they have similar metaphysical foundations. And I think that poses some problems for Locke. But looking at, what's commonly regarded as that tradition from the history of thought, there are a lot of other theorists and theorists that write decades before Hobbes writes that we want to consider. The second thing is, I think, theoretical. The government by consent. So if I can, by social contract theory, if I can take that to mean here, even though there are differences, scholars get into rarefied territory, distinguishing social contract from the principle of consent, from popular sovereignty, and those are important distinctions. For our purposes, let me just treat social contract theory in the sense here of political contractarianism and the principle of consent. I'll just sort of bring these together. Consent is necessary for political authority and obligation. That way of thinking is an application of the moral norm of promise keeping, that we should keep our promises, that we should keep faith, that there's a moral obligation to do that. And so political contractarianism isn't a sort of, or it's not supposed to be a kind of pure contractualism where we just, promise with no foundation and there all of a sudden we've got something magic. It's sprung up. Let's call that metaphysical nonsense on stilts, right? I mean, I think there are some theorists who think we can't agree on anything. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get together and we're going to consent, and somehow that consent is going to bind us, but it's not founded on anything. That's incoherent. And it's incoherent because it is a sheer exercise of will. And will, as such, doesn't impose obligations, right? We can think of different instances of will. I'll be teaching Plato later, so reading Plato's Republic. I grew up in Northeast Ohio, going to see the now Cleveland Guardians play baseball, have a nice glass of Chianti, go see a choir concert by one of my daughters, an art showing by another. These are different instances of will, and we have individual will. We have the will of the majority in a political community if it's determined by the majority. We might have the exercise of will to go above and beyond obligation to rescue someone at great peril. Maybe they're drowning and we throw ourselves into a turbulent sea to save them. Different exercises of will, right? Well, with respect to exercises of will, there's this will and there's that will, but you'd never say just on account of will, some exercise of will is binding. That would be like saying, for instance, I have the set of prime numbers starting with 2 and running to infinity and saying, well, I think that 7 and 13 are normative for the rest with respect to primeness. And you say, that's ridiculous. They're both prime numbers. They're equally prime numbers. And the same as with will. You can't say, well, an exercise of will binds us because it's an exercise of will when you have all these other instances of will that are not binding.
Mm.
What binds us must be something that transcends that set and is normative for it. So if some exercises of will have some ought to them and others don't, there must be something that's not reducible to will from which the oughtness derives, right? A real good. So
Just to clarify for my own understanding, so when you're saying that will is not in itself binding, so say I go to the pool one day, and because I go to the pool one day doesn't mean I should go to the pool every day or the next day, or that I'm obligated to continue doing that thing.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, great.
Yeah. So what does that mean? It means that if we get together, we say, oh, sheesh, we don't want to live in the state of nature. Look at all these people treating each other badly. And we have no foundation, but we're just going to agree together to create a society and a sovereign, and we'll be bound by the law. And it's just that consent, that sheer consent. There's no reason that binds us. That doesn't do anything. Say, okay, you know what? Right, we need a moral basis. Well, maybe it's justice, but justice is our convention, our customs, our understanding. You say, well, it's got the same problem, though.
Mhm.
That's just founded on acts of will. It's just founded on our making. And here's the deal. We make various conventions, and we maybe we think some are good and some are not. How do we distinguish some conventions from others on the basis of convention, right? Or why should we be bound by our conventions rather than deciding to act contrary to them?
Mhm.
Convention alone can't tell us that. And so the idea that justice could be a matter of convention is an attempt to have a will-based account of morality. We would call this voluntarism in the realm of meta-ethics. That is, theories about what's right and wrong, good and evil. Voluntarism is a word that is multivalent depending on which discipline you're in. But here, by voluntarism, I just mean a will-based account of morality. And conventionalism is a will-based account of morality, and those are incoherent. Say, okay. So what we need then is to back up to an account of promise keeping that where the obligation to keep our promises doesn't derive from will alone, that is founded in some real uncreated goodness, ultimately.
So I can see how that would start to impose, okay, classical natural law theory is now needed. We can start talking about
Yeah.
Aristotelian issues
Yeah.
and moral and obligation past just this consent. So that's starting to become clear to me. I'm curious though, once we've started to include the classical natural law theory, what happens to consent and what is the role of consent in the context where classical natural law theory is now being applied to our social obligations?
Yeah. So I'd say two things. One is that my argument is that a coherent account, an intelligible account of consent theory requires or presumes as its foundation classical natural law, a real and uncreated good. And not to say that classical natural law by itself entails the necessity of consent, right? But the moment we say that consent to be coherent requires classical natural law, that opposition of classical natural law to consent that we find in Hobbes trying to found um, uh, uh, an account of covenant and government by covenant, even if hypothetical, in modern moral metaphysics, we begin to see that actually not only are those two things, Hobbes's philosophy or modern moral philosophy and consent, um, uh, those two things don't actually go together. They're actually at odds. They're in contradiction with each other. But also that consent really does presuppose classical natural law, which means there's an essential link there. Now, at the same time, going a little bit beyond where I go in the book, I think. Although I have some reference to this, I would say that human equality entails something in the realm of consent. So, and about this, I think Locke is right, but it's not just in Locke. It's in Sidney, for instance. It's in certain of the Salamancan Thomists. It's in Hooker. Hadley Arcus in his book First Things. I'd say from which the journal takes its title, since Father Newhouse is no longer with us. In his book First Things, frames it this way: given that human beings are equal, no person can be the master of another human being the same way that human beings could be the master of other animals. And given that, consent is necessary to establish the authority of some over others. And I think that I think the late Gene Hampton is right to say that there is something of this strain, a kind of consent theory in Aristotle. She would say, well, Aristotle was a natural subordinate, or affirmed natural subordination. Aristotle did affirm that, but she says, there are scholars who raise questions as to exactly how we parse Aristotle here. But she says, but there is this sort of consent strain. Insofar as people are equal, nature doesn't establish who rules whom, and so it seems that consent is necessary. Now, there are others who say, well, no, Aristotle just says people should take turns ruling and being ruled, right? But it may be that requires some degree of consent to establish who's ruling when and who's being ruled when, and participation in the exercise of political rule. And I think that Hampton may be onto something there. So I think that natural law alone doesn't entail the necessity of government by consent, but rather natural law or natural justice plus human equality entails something a lot like consent. Now, we can then get back to the problem of where are we going to get individual consent from? We don't have it. What modern regime has it, right? So A. John Simmons has this wonderful argument in a book called On the Edge of Anarchy, in which he says, John Locke is right. Consent is necessary for political authority and obligations, and it must be real consent, actual consent, because only that is really doing something. Hypothetical consent doesn't do something, and to incur political obligation, to authorize political authority, we've really got to do something. And then says tacit consent can be real, but Locke and no one else give us any sign of tacit consent. So Locke is right. Consent is necessary. He then says, also, David Hume, who's very critical of Locke, is right. We have this paucity of actual consent, explicit or tacit. It's really quite lacking. From which he infers, though we could in principle have political authority and political obligation, from which he infers what he calls philosophical anarchism, which is, in fact, most people and most regimes don't have an obligation to obey, and most regimes lack authority over most of the people they claim to govern. It might be prudent to go along, and there are a number of legal theorists who I think move in this direction. I think Leslie Green, for instance, in The Authority of the State, seems to think that consent is necessary, but also hardly anybody consents. So government lacks really authority, but the state's effective and people go along, or something along. It doesn't have authority. We don't have obligations for the most part. But so I think, listen, if we take a large national society, a nation state, then in practice we are going to have difficulty obtaining individual consent. And if consent really is necessary given human equality, then we are going to have regimes that lack legitimacy, that lack authority. And that would seem to be a real crisis for political order. However, the American founders and framers, I think, especially the founders in general, were building on a tradition. And Don Lutz demonstrates in the origins of American constitutionalism a kind of consistency here from the 17th to the 18th century of building political community from the ground up, right? And if we read some of the early covenant theorists of early modernity, they will talk about pre-political associations, families, congregations, guilds, and various kinds of associations that are pre-political that form the first level of political community, the town, the city, something like that. And then cities that join together to build something larger. And in the actual settlement, especially of New England, but also in no small part of the middle colonies, we see these initial settlements that band together and they create something bigger, a more general government, and they're building from the ground up, right? So that by the time we begin with political authority, political incorporation, we're already beyond individual consent. Individuals are members of associations, and those associations are members of political community, right? And then the base level political communities form the next level so that we are not dealing with a kind of political individualism by the time we get to something like the level of the Commonwealth or of the nation state. So I think that A. John Simmons, Leslie Green, Nick Wolterstorff, and some others pose some real problems for purely individual level consent all the way down, which is to say, I don't think it's not that we don't need it or at all, but it's more like we need it combined with a grassroots construction, not just chronologically, but of political order built from the ground up, which would requires decentralization. It's very much at odds with the sort of statism you see in Woodrow Wilson or in Crowley, which is a kind of top-down, derives from Hobbes and the idea of the modern theory of sovereignty. The other way that we might go here, and Wolterstorff mentions this, it's something that is in our founding documents too, and I don't think there's an either or, but it's to emphasize popular sovereignty, which is to say, Wolterstorff says, well, let's distinguish a social contract, by which he means an original contract. You know, not a lot of regimes find an original contract, and why should the original contract be binding? Most social contract theorists want to say, we're talking about consent here and now, not just where political order comes from, if that at all. And he said, distinguish that from then an original contract from consent. And David Hume is still saying you're not going to get individual consent. People are, and distinguish that from popular sovereignty. And he says, a lot of people won't like the metaphysics of popular sovereignty because it requires a real whole, a kind of corporate whole that really exists. It's at odds with nominalism. But I think you could argue that natural equality entails something like popular sovereignty, where popular sovereignty is not a democratic state in the Woodrow Wilson sense of things, but popular sovereignty is something a lot like the authority of the community. And you find this, the authority of the communitas in medieval thought and then in late medieval thought, high medieval, late medieval. The idea of political authority rests with the community, which delegates a government to exercise it, right? When Aquinas writes about this, he says, listen, a political community can either alienate their political authority to other rulers, in which case, if there's tyranny, their recourse is to pray, right? Or they can hold on to it. And if they hold on to it and they delegate rulers and those rulers abuse, they can depose them. On account of this, he at one point mentions the Senate's second deposition of a Roman imperator after Julius Caesar. But by the time you get to Bellarmine and some others, Suarez, They're saying, on account of human equality, political authority always resides with the community that delegates a government, but that retains a right to revoke that delegation, to depose that government, to replace that government. That's before you find it in John Locke.
Mhm.
That's in Bellarmine. Before you find it in John Locke, that's in Francisco Suarez, who says sometimes a just war must be waged against the king. Hobbes really hated those guys. Yeah.
Well, and that leads to my next question, but like as we start to wrap up, which is these are really important conversations to recognize and to see that what we might have thought as unique to Locke or Hobbes was actually their conversations and cultures of thinking that were existing long before the two of them. And that's important to recognize the context where some of these ideas are perhaps impacting our lives. But in regards to the arguments that you're making about consent and decentralization and equality of of humans, what does it mean for someone in our current political life and their civic engagement?
I think it means a couple of things. At the very practical level, I think the project points in the direction of thinking about how we build political order. And we belong to a constitutional order that began by building from the ground up, from primary associations that were pre-political, uh, that serve as, if you will, the building blocks of political associations and local political associations that serve as the building block of something later. And it entailed a kind of not radical autonomy, but a kind of autonomy, a kind of local self-government. That is, what does taking consent theory seriously, or human equality and the necessity of consent seriously entail? I think one of the things that it entails is self-government, but self-government is only self-government to the degree that we are involved in the exercise of self-government. And we can only really be involved, most of us, in the exercise of self-government at the local level. And so this requires that local communities have substantial ability to govern themselves, not absolute. There are some things like slavery, for instance, that local communities should not be allowed to do. Segregation or something along those lines. So I think there are boundaries, there are limits to that, but I think you begin with local communities that govern themselves. What comes to mind is a story from the Revolutionary era about local community and local self-government. So in 1843, Judge Mellon Chamberlain, he would become Judge Mellon Chamberlain, the future Judge Mellon Chamberlain, I should say. He was then about 21 years old, and I think out of Harvard, relatively fresh, or maybe at Harvard at the time. He's 21, and in 1843, the future Judge Chamberlain interviews Captain Levi Preston, who was then about 91. In 1775, Captain Preston had fought in the Battle of Concord at the North Bridge. And my friends in Massachusetts all tell me Concord is the way to say it. I always want to say Concord, but Concord. All right, here's how the exchange goes. The 21-year-old Chamberlain interviewing Captain Preston. Captain Preston, why'd you go to Concord to fight? Preston, what did I go for? Chamberlain, yeah, my histories tell me that you revolutionary men took up arms against intolerable oppression. What was it? Preston says, oppression? I didn't feel any oppression that I know of. Chamberlain says, well, what about the Stamp Act? The Stamp Act was oppressive, right? And Preston tells him, I never saw any stamps, and I understood that none of them were ever sold, which was true, right? The Stamp Act agents all resigned before the Stamp Act could go into effect. Good for them. So I never saw any stamps. None were ever sold. Chamberlain, what about the tea tax? Preston, I never drank any of the tea. The boys all threw it overboard. Chamberlain's getting a little frustrated now, right? Chamberlain's like, well, I suppose you'd been reading Harrington, Sidney, Locke about the eternal principle of liberty. Preston, I never heard of those men. The only books we had were the Bible, the Catechism, and Watts' Psalms and Hymns, and the almanacs. Chamberlain, what was the matter? Why'd you go fight? And there's a few different ways that the ending of this conversation is recorded. In one published version, Preston says, young man, what we meant in fighting the British was this. We had always been free and we meant to be free always. In another version, and you'll find this recounted in Samuel Morrison's famous History of the Revolution, but also in one of David Hackett Fisher's books, Preston's reply runs something like this. What was the matter, young man? What we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We always governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should, i.e., they meant we should not. And the question is, what would Preston have meant when he said we always governed ourselves and we meant to, and they meant we should not, or when he said we'd always been free and we meant to always be free? What did he mean by that? And here he was not referring, I think, to purely individual freedom. He's not referring to purely individual self-government. He is, of course, referring to Concord and Lexington and Salem and Boston had been communities that governed themselves as communities, right? And they meant to keep governing themselves as communities rather than being governed from the top down, right? And so for them, if you will, being governed by Crown and Parliament comprehensively. Of course, they conceded that Parliament had some role, or at least some of them did, and that the Crown, of course, had some role because they had charters with the Crown. But under those charters, they were communities that governed themselves within boundaries, and they meant to go on governing themselves. Now, I think that we can't get meaningful individual consent, or maybe I should say it would be very difficult to get in practice. In principle, we could get consent from everyone, but it's not likely that we're going to get individual consent on the broad nation-state scale. Okay. By the way, we're not going to get a ton by way of self-government on the broad nation-state scale, right? We'll have people choosing people who govern them insofar as we have an elective system. We'll have representation, perhaps, if that functions well. But of course, Aristotle notes that elections, the characteristic means by which oligarchs choose their leaders. And I don't think that elections mean oligarchy, but elections don't mean self-government by themselves, right? What we need is people who participate in the exercise of self-government. And by and large, that can only happen at the local level. We can't have complete local autonomy. There are things that should not be a matter of local autonomy, like slavery, like segregation. Also, we have communities close to each other and they're part of a shared system. You'll get externalities, spillover effects that need to be addressed. And there are some goods that local communities can't provide for themselves. They can't provide, for instance, defense adequately or something like that. And so there are reasons to have provinces or states, in our case, the Commonwealth or the nation, but to the extent that the principle of consent founds or grounds self-government, then self-government is something that we can only participate in the exercise of it rather than choosing people who govern us at the local level. And so that requires not radical local autonomy, not complete and total local autonomy, but some real space for local government. And that means that the principle of consent, self-government, I think popular sovereignty mean building political order from the ground up and in a way that individuals participate and give a kind of active consent through participation at the local level in their local communities. I might add here then that a real question that is posed for Americans is, do we want self-government? I think the answer of a lot of Americans might well be no. We'd like to have some role or the ability to choose people who govern us, but we don't actually want to participate in the exercise of it. I think there's still something to be said for. When de Tocqueville observed America, Americans still wanted to be involved in the exercise of self-government. Don Lutz notes that early on, there were sometimes in those early settlements and early towns, more offices than there were citizens to fill them. Yeah, but this is at the foundation of our order, and consent in our order is meant to ground self-government. And I think there's something to be said for self-government. I think even human equality, as Aristotle suggests, is Aristotle says, insofar as people are equal, they should rule and be ruled in turns. They should take turns ruling and being ruled. And what he means is they should participate in the exercise of government, not just choose their leaders. I think there's something to that idea. And I think that human equality can point us in the direction of popular sovereignty, and that means self-government in this sense, and that's practical. But it would also require, I think, some decentralization, recognition of the idea that local associations and local communities, to some degree, have by state and national government had aspects of self-government usurped, or they're if it's still there to a degree, the ability to really make the decisions themselves, not everywhere, not in everything, but not just in a few things either, in some really important substantive things.
Well, Dr. DeHart, thank you so much for coming on to Madison's Notes today to share with us your new book, The Social Contract in the Ruins. Please make sure to like, subscribe, and follow Dr. DeHart on any available socials. So again, Dr. DeHart, thank you so much for coming on today's episode.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Madison's Notes. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the philosophical foundations of political authority with Dr. Paul DeHart and his thought-provoking book, The Social Contract in the Ruins. Dr. DeHart's arguments offer a fresh perspective on the ongoing debate between social contract theory and classical natural law, and his work has challenged me to rethink the moral grounds of political obligation and governments. So, if you found this conversation insightful, don't forget to check out Dr. DeHart's other works, including Uncovering the Constitution's Moral Design. Be sure to subscribe to Madison's Notes so you will never miss an episode, and feel free to share your thoughts or questions with us on social media. Until next time, I'm Laura the Rent, and we'll see you on the next episode of Madison's Notes.